Hi, I'm Naomi Murphy, and this is the Locked Up Living podcast, where we talk with a wide range of people about harsh aspects of institutional life.
We also explore some of the ways to overcome them and to grow and develop. I'm David Jones. So join us every Wednesday morning, 6 o'clock UK time, for a fresh podcast.
Okay. Today we're joined by Faith Spear. Faith is lead author of Criminal Justice blog. She's a criminologist and a very active prison reform advocate. And until 2017, she was the chair of the Independent Monitoring Board at HMP YOI Hollesley Bay. Really pleased to see you today, Faith. Welcome.
Lovely to see you too.
Well, hello, Faith.
Hello.
So very good to meet you, and a very interesting subject. Having worked at two Cat B prisons at Crendon and Gartree, I kind of had this feeling of often being in the prison and maybe walking past members of the IMB, but very rarely sitting down to talk with someone from the IMB. So perhaps we can explore what that's like a bit later on. Perhaps it would help, Faith, if you could begin by telling us, what is the Independent Monitoring Board exactly, and what does it do?
Well, it's a statutory body, so that means that there has to be a board in every prison. It's made up of volunteers, and it varies in the number depending on the size of prison. When I worked in Hollesley Bay, there was about 9, 10, maybe 11 at the most on our board. The role of the IMB is to monitor, and so you have access 24/7 to the prison that you're part of. And what you do is you're on a rota for me, it was like every month, so many days a month that you commit to. You check healthcare, you go and have a look at education. You make yourself available if anyone wants to talk to you about their problems, any queries they've got that they're not satisfied with going to a prison officer. It's a variety of things. And then what you do, if you're on the rota, then you will write up a report each month. We'll then collate it and then see the governor once a month and discuss any issues that have come up. So it's a fascinating, absolutely fascinating role to have, and I absolutely loved it. So you don't actually do training before you become a member. That can be within 3-6 months of starting, which I don't feel that that's right, because it's a completely different world. You're not sure what you're going to expect. And I think members need a little bit more preparation before they actually go in. You do, for the first year, you're supposed to have a mentor and you're supposed to only go with another member. But if your board is very short of members, that's not going to happen for very long. So you could be sort of dropped in the deep end, but it's absolutely fascinating.
Yeah, it sounds like it. And you mentioned that you had access 24/7, I think. So would you go there during the night time?
Well, that's an interesting thing, because I raised that issue. No is the answer, because if it's in the evening, of like office hours, outside of office hours, you need someone to be with you. Now, you can't monitor independently if you have a governor beside you, directing you here, or, have a look at this, whatever. You haven't really got that freedom like you should have. And also at night, you have different members of staff. The regime is completely different. There's less staff. So you don't actually see really what happens in the prison if you're not able to go in the evening. I mean, if there was an incident, the IMB would be contacted, and then either the chair or someone who is available would go in and then monitor the situation. But generally speaking, very few members would actually go in at night.
Thank you. I would imagine they're rather spooky places at night.
Yeah.
So what did you do before you joined the IMB, Faith?
Well, I worked in the voluntary sector for over 20 years. I was a community leader in my area. So I mainly dealt with, families, children, also including asylum seekers, worked with asylum seekers. So I had I had an idea. I knew what really was going on in my area. I live in Suffolk, and I felt that I needed something a little bit different. But we moved abroad for a few years, and when we came back to the same area, and I decided to become a full-time student. So I went to the local university. It was quite challenging because as a mature student, you are looked at differently. And also you act a lot differently. You don't crawl in to lectures, drunk because of the night before. And also you want to get your money's worth. And I had very little time because still bringing up a family. I had 2 children at school, 1 at college. And also my husband decided to study as well. So he did his master's while I was doing my degree. So it was a hectic 3 years, should I say. And then I came out with a Bachelor of Science with honours in criminology. I hadn't really done anything to do with criminology before that, apart from when I was 19. I worked for NACRO, National Association of Care of Offenders. I was just in the admin and I did the wages. But I met some fascinating people that just come out of prison, and their stories that have kept with me all these years. So I think then a seed was sown, and I think that's why I then chose criminology rather than something sort of arty, which, history of art or something like that. Most people would have thought that I'd do something like that, but criminology was definitely something that I wanted to study. I knew very little about it. And then once I finished, I trained to be a gateway assessor with Citizens Advice Bureau for a year. And then I saw the opportunity of joining the IMB.
Right. So, as you said, you wanted to do something different and you found your way to the criminology course and then spotted this opportunity. What did you expect of the role before you started?
Well, to be honest, I didn't have a lot of information about it. And because there's no training beforehand, it was a little difficult, but I was up for the challenge, and to be honest, I was very excited. I mean, I had been in Hosley Bay Prison before because I was part of Prison Fellowship, which they run victim awareness courses. So I'd been part of that, and then I was the area leader for that, for Prison Fellowship. But I had to step down from that when I joined the IMB because it was definitely a conflict of interest. So I knew Hosley Bay a little, but then to be given access to a prison in that way was something that I hadn't had before. I took it quite seriously. It wasn't just something to fill up some time. It definitely wasn't a hobby. It was a lot more than that. And I just sort of jumped straight in, I suppose.
And did you have at that time a good understanding of the relationship between the prison service and the IMB, or is that something that developed in time?
Well, it definitely developed. I mean, initially, I believed it was an independent organisation, as it said in its title. But it wasn't long where I realised, no, it's not. It's part of the Ministry of Justice. And because it's funded by the Ministry of Justice, your expenses are paid by the Ministry of Justice, the IMB Secretariat, MOJ employees, as is the National Chair. So you can't call it an independent organisation. It's definitely a monitoring board, and I think they should just cut the independent off. I've been saying that for years, but they haven't quite done that yet, but I'm hoping they will. Some of the prisoners were, those held at Hosley Bay, and I mean, when I talked to other members of the IMB from other prisons, it was like those in prison thought we were part of the establishment. So there was the lack of, I suppose, trust, lack of wanting to really reveal if they did have some issues that they wanted looking at, because they didn't actually see us as independent. So that was difficult to try and show, no, we're there for you. If there are issues that need to be raised, either with the governor or more of a national level, well, then that's what we were there for. But there were very many that were very wary of us, which is a shame. It's a shame because I'm sure there would be a lot more that we could do if they would, trust us.
Do you think staff saw you as part of the establishment as well?
Well, it was interesting because some members of staff had never actually heard of the IMB. And the IMB, I think it was 2004 or 2003 when it became the IMB. And the fact that staff didn't know that we existed showed that it wasn't functioning as it should. I suppose I got on with most staff. I definitely got on with the governor, but I wasn't going to be like pally with them. You know, I had a role to monitor, not manage, and that's a fine line sometimes, because I noticed that some members of the IMB, because their background probably in managerial jobs, they wanted to manage. But that was not our role. It was to monitor, to be on the lookout, you know, not to miss things. But this likewise for the staff. They weren't there to manage us. We had the right to be there. And yeah, I suppose there was a bit of rubbing up and down, you know, not everyone appreciated us there, especially I remember one incident, for 3 weeks in a row, one of the units was very filthy. And, you know, that's the kind of thing that we'd need to, you know, put on our report each week. And after the 3rd week, I was the 3rd person to go in, and the person who was in charge of that unit tore a strip off me. And I said, you know, why? We're just writing what we see, what we hear, and it's for the governor, but the governor had had a go at them because, yeah, again, he'd seen our report and it hadn't been dealt with. But it wasn't for that member of staff to try and manage me. That was not their remit at all. But, you know...
No, it sounds an extremely challenging job, Faith, because you were continually having to negotiate your entrance to places. Yeah. Managing, you were there to, in a sense, manage your
Yeah.
I did often used to wonder about that, seeing the IMB wandering around Whitemore, actually, and thinking, you know, as human beings, we all have a need to belong and get on with the community. And I did wonder how personally challenging it must be to be in a position where there is the potential for some conflict if you're raising concerns, that things that might not be appreciated by the establishment in terms of having attention drawn to. And I think you must have to be quite a resilient individual to do that role effectively.
And also you have to look at your own security. I never had a whistle. I didn't have a radio. Hoseley Bay is on an 85-acre site. You know, so if there was a problem, who would be there for me? I used to think that, because when you monitored, once you'd done your basic training and that, you picked up your keys and then off you went and did your monitoring. You didn't have to let someone know where you're going first, or you just go and do it. So I always used to think about my own security, because it's a volunteer position. You don't get paid for it. It was different I suppose for me, because it was an open prison. But when you're in a closed prison, you'd hope that everyone would have a radio. And when I queried about why couldn't I have a radio, they said, well, we've got the radios, but we haven't got enough batteries. So it wasn't seen as something, as an essential piece of equipment.
Discussion amongst the IMB staff about things like fear and safety and being able to acknowledge those feelings. Because obviously if you're not able to if you can talk about being frightened, it actually makes it much easier to manage it, doesn't it? But if you're not able to talk about it, there's much more likelihood of people using unhelpful strategies to manage their feelings of fear.
But then people would say that if you're fearful, why are you doing the role?
Well, I personally don't think... I think if you're working in a prison, it's inevitable that you feel frightened at times. But, you know, being brave involves being able to feel your fear. So in the unit that I worked in, we would always talk about that amongst the staff, because it isn't normal to wander around amongst people who you know have committed really serious offences, especially if you're there on your own. And actually, you can be frightened, but it doesn't have to change what you're going to do in terms of your behaviour. You know, we say to prisoners at times, you know, the way you're behaving is really frightening me right now. It doesn't mean I'm going to do anything different, but actually you need to recognise that your behaviour's frightening. But I think if you're not able to find a way to talk about fear, how do you know how that's influencing does that mean that people turn a blind eye to things that because it becomes too frightening to spot those things? It's a horrible position to be in, it seems.
Yeah, I remember an IMB member saying to me, if I see something that's maybe not quite right, I'll walk away. And I thought, have you done your basic training? Do you know what your role is about? You can't always just walk away and think, oh no, that's too complicated. Sometimes you have to deal with different issues. I mean, for myself, the only time I can honestly say that I felt fearful in a prison, and I've visited every category of prison, I've worked in a couple of prisons, was Whitemore. That is the only prison. And I remember being up at one of the landings and just the fear got hold of me just for a moment. I never felt that again. But it was just at that moment. But I can't think that was ever discussed at a meeting when we all got together once a month about the fear and what would you do. And I can't remember members being that open. I don't know, it's because we're in a category D prison, so it was very different. Because there was less risk, because of, those that have been in prison a long while, by the time to get to Cat D, they are definitely risk assessed to be able to be in that prison. But even if I did feel fearful, who would I talk to?
It doesn't sound like the service was well prepared for it.
No, I mean, the secretariat were never particularly helpful. I mean, I remember one incident, I had to attend an inquest of a young man that had died, but it was 2 years before I'd even joined the IMB. But as I was vice chair then of the board, and the chair, he was off on holiday, so I had no choice, I had to attend. So I contacted the secretariat for some help, some advice, because I knew that I would have to be like a witness there. What would I say and whatever. I said, because I didn't really know the case. So sorry, we can't help you. Nothing. So I had to attend that inquest and I had to stand up, and there was the family of that involved, and I had to speak. And I found that really hard. And at that point, I was so tempted to say, I'm a volunteer. I don't get paid for this. I'm not doing this anymore. But so if there was a situation that I found myself in, I can't think, because of my experience, that I would have the help that I would possibly need.
Sounds really awful position to be in, just listening to that role, to be honest with you. And I know when I was in my 20s, I worked in a Cat D prison, and actually that didn't feel safe, because if you got caught in between, when the prisoner movement, then you would be on your own with a lot of men milling around in a way that didn't feel very particularly safe or contained. But at Whitemore, I'd say I often felt scared, but that was okay because I allowed myself to have an emotional response. I wasn't in any danger. And we encouraged staff to talk about it. So, I mean, I loved that job working there. I was there for 17 years. So it didn't put me off the work, but I think that's partly because I had the permission to just be there as an authentic being. I think it's very difficult to do a role where you have to suppress what you're feeling. And, an IMB, certainly for Whitemore, I think it's quite a small team. So, that also, I think, enhances your vulnerability if you're there mainly on your own.
Yeah.
I mean, I think you're kind of hinting at how easy it is to have an impact as part of the IMB, Faith.
Well, you want to do your best. You want to be there. It can be all sorts of questions, situations that people are in, and sometimes they just want someone to talk to. That, not someone who's like more of a threatening role, or, and I always felt it was a privilege to actually step inside a prison, because you're stepping into someone else's world, someone else's life. You don't know their background. That's one thing I never did. I never asked, what you're in for. It's not for me to ask that kind of question, but sometimes they would want to talk about it. And many occasions I sat outside one of the units, because it's near the sea. It's actually a beautiful sight if you ever go there. I sit on a bench with one of the men, and they would just pour their heart out. Someone is willing to spend their time there for them, just to talk. I mean, I loved it. I learned so much. I really did. I learned so much. But I find that members can be on a board for up to 15 years. I think that's too long. I think you get stuck in a rut, stuck in ways, and then if you get new members and they do the training and there's some new things to bring, they're very reluctant because, oh no, we've always done it this way. Yeah, well, maybe it might be a good idea to change it a little, but no, we've always done it that way. And you find that annual reports, when you have to write an annual report for the Secretary, Prisons Minister, should I say. And you often say the same thing year after year after year. And you become complacent. And I think that's a tragic thing to do, because you're just going through the motions. The IMB should have a greater impact. Recommendations in annual reports should be looked at, taken notice of. But the annual reports are just put on a proverbial shelf, aren't they, to collect dust?
Seems a little bit like paying lip service, and
yeah.
I suppose it has me thinking about the number of prison inspections, completed by the inspectorate,
Yeah.
where they find prisons are failing in quite severe ways. And I wondered, what are the implications of these for the IMB?
Well, it's the same as, the inspectorate, they used to write these amazing reports and they'd have maybe 60 recommendations in different categories. But then, I don't know whether prison governors were overwhelmed with all that. So it was then, a couple of years ago, it was then reduced to maybe 6 main things. So things that were an issue before suddenly are not. With the IMB, you write recommendations to the governor, to the secretariat, and then to the minister, prisons minister. And then often you will get a response now, maybe a few months later, from the prisons minister. But there's no guarantee of anything that you say will actually be adhered to, because there's no obligation. I remember writing, because I write quite a bit. In my blogs, I wrote one about recommendations are futile, and I got a bit of backlash from it. But it's true. If you're not going to take any notice of recommendations, you can either think, oh, well, we'll just keep doing it, we'll just keep plugging away, or, oh, why do we bother? It shouldn't be like that. If you're the eyes and the ears, which, according to the IMB website, you're the eyes and ears for, society. So if you're going to mention things that need to be looked at, surely you should expect someone to actually do that. That's why you're doing it.
Thank you. What was the emotional toll of the work, Faith? Because it sounds a bit soul-destroying listening to it.
I think when I saw young people, the age of my kids, I think that's when it sort of hits hard. They've got all their life ahead of them, but there's going to be a stigma attached to the fact that they were in prison for a while. I mean, I'm really hoping that will change, and that, it won't be with you for the rest of your life, and that you won't be able to carry on. But I made sure I had a support network. I think you have to have some good friends and my family that stood by me, because it can have an effect on you. I try to be quite positive about it, that I would do what I could. But, if no one took any notice of what you were saying, well, then it's a bit hard. But I always look forward to going. It was challenging. You didn't know what you would come across. You didn't know what stories you'd hear. But I think because I really wanted to be there, no one was forcing me. And the fact that I was a volunteer, I didn't get paid for it. It's not that I don't feel that I became hardened to the things that I heard. I remember I visited lots of prisons, and just one women's prison. I visited Holloway just before it closed, and I was invited by one of the governors to go along and have a look. And I saw real sadness, I don't really know how to explain it, but I didn't stay there very long. It was just that day. But I said to myself, I never want to work in a women's prison, because I think emotionally, I don't think I could have coped with it. I remember going into a room, loads of desks, and it was full. It was a real lively room, and there was all these organisations all working together to try and help some of the women there, and I was amazed, really amazed, and I respect them highly. But for me, I don't think I could have done that. I couldn't have worked in a women's prison. It would have taken its toll on me. I know it would.
Yes, they can be very sad places. I've visited a couple recently. It doesn't sound as if you got a lot of support from colleagues, though, Faith.
Well, we all came from different backgrounds, different areas. We'd never known each other before we'd suddenly be working together on a board. No, I mean, there was one person, I suppose, that I got on really well with. It's not that I didn't get on with people. They're not your friends. They don't come from the same sort of background as you. I mean, so you've got to suddenly form a board, work together, and that's not easy. It's not easy. But no, thinking about it, I suppose I stood out. Maybe it was my own fault that I didn't get the support that I needed, but I took my role very seriously, and not everyone did.
Did you ever, as a group of colleagues, sit down and talk about things, talk about the work?
Well, we had a board meeting once a month, so part of that we would discuss issues that would come up against that month and prepare questions for the governor, who would come for the second part of the meeting. So we used to spend almost a day together. We'd have lunch there. But I tried to make it a little bit more informal. I used to bring nice cakes or something, or I used to get the men there in catering. They did amazing cakes to provide a cake. I'd buy one of their cakes and then we'd have it together. But it was, I suppose it was more difficult when I became vice chair and then chairman, because I suddenly had quite a responsibility on my shoulders. I wasn't just responsible for the work I was doing, I was responsible for the board, for the others too. And so my relationship with the governor changed after that, because the buck stopped with me.
So why did you end up leaving, Faith?
Well, I'd been the chair for about 3-4 months, and I was invited by the editor of the Prison's Handbook, which is like a book in every prison, and anyone to do with justice and prisons, they're likely to have got one of these handbooks. It's a huge thing. And I was invited to write an article about my experiences of the Independent Monitoring Board. Because I saw something online, and I challenged the editor of something that he said. I challenged him. He said, all right then, if you think differently, write me an article and I'll publish it. So I reread what he'd put out, and I had already got part of my article ready, because I often write and I have things ready in case I need it, if I've got an outlet to actually put it out. So I'd got this article, and within 2 hours I'd sent him the first draft, and he was very shocked about that. But I didn't use my name. I used a pseudonym, because I felt it was the issues that needed to be raised, not me, not my profile. I'm not like that. So I wrote this article, and we named it Whistleblower Without a Whistle. Because I didn't have a whistle, I didn't have a radio, I didn't have anything. In it, I talked about the IMB, the structure of it, issues that I'd come across, the recruitment, which was just ridiculous, tick box exercise. Things that I'd seen in prisons, where's the purposeful activity, what you're actually doing with the people there, you're basically warehousing people. And I covered many subjects. But then before it went to print, we had a president then of the IMB. We now have a national chair, but we had a president of the IMB. And he got a copy of this article, And he sent it out to every member and anyone to do with it. So the National Council, the Secretariat, every IMB member got my article. Well, they didn't know who had written it at that point, with a covering letter saying how about the inaccuracies and that he was taking it to the MOJ lawyers. But I didn't name any prison. I didn't name anyone. I raised many issues. And boy, did that, I suppose, put me in hot water. But I felt that I needed to. I felt that it was important. I felt that the IMB, its profile, it was just... Someone said to me, actually, the IMB, that's the old people, isn't it? What? Because that's what they'd seen. That's what they thought. Mention the IMB, oh yeah, the old people that just wander around with their little clipboards or whatever, the tick box. And I didn't want to be part of that. I didn't feel the IMB should be part of that. At that point, it was costing the Ministry of Justice £2 million. So you think, come on, we've got, something's got to change. I had to identify myself in the end. Someone recognised something. One of the members of my board, and I still don't know who, recognised that it's probably me. So I got a phone call and they said, are you the author? And I said, yes. Well, you need to give an account for it at the next board meeting. So I said, okay. So I presumed that we were going to do that. I would say that I am, and the reasons why I wrote that, etc. And then we get on with the rest of the board meetings and then see the governors as usual. But I didn't realise that the board, certain members of my board, had been in contact with the Secretariat and in cahoots to come down on me. It ended up that I got to the board meeting, I gave my talk, I explained and that, and then I had like 40, 50 minutes of every member firing questions at me. I was shocked. I was bullied, basically. And I was then sent out of the room so they could discuss. Discuss what? I didn't know anything about it. This had been planned with the Secretariat. I only found that out much, much later on when someone sent me an email trail that they wanted me to resign and they wanted me to step down as being the chair. And if not, they would refuse to work with me. But doing that meant that they wouldn't be fulfilling their role, the statutory role. And I knew that the monitoring had to carry on. So out of the blue, I got a letter from the prisons minister suspending me. I was about to leave to go to the prison. I was monitoring that week and I thought, I'd just check my emails just before I left. And there was an email saying that I wasn't allowed in. Wasn't that I wasn't allowed in any prison. I just wasn't allowed in Hoathly Bay because the only reason I went there was because I was in the IMB. What followed was months after that of investigations. I was investigated twice by the Ministry of Justice. I ended up in front of a disciplinary hearing in Petty France and I was then dismissed from my role for gross misconduct and banned from the IMB for 5 years. All because I told the truth. I said it as it was. I didn't try and cover up things. It'd been a bit of a sleepy organisation and people hadn't heard about the IMB. But I raised its profile because my story didn't just go locally in the local paper. It went nationally and it went internationally. They didn't expect that. Not at all. They tried their hardest to silence me. But I decided to fight them because of what I'd seen in prisons. People deserve better. You can't just warehouse people and expect them to come back in society and join it and just live law-abiding life. It doesn't happen, as you can see by the reoffending rate. The overcrowding, the conditions that I have seen in different prisons is shocking. And it's the taxpayers' money that's paying for it.
Sounds a really bruising experience, Faith. Sounds awful. And actually, I was quite shocked to hear that, considering it's run by staffed by volunteers, it's costing £2 million if it's not then able to be effective. But it sounds like a really horrible way to end doing a work role that you were clearly very passionate about. I just wonder, looking back with the benefit of hindsight, would you have done anything differently to try and affect change?
I have no regrets. I have no regrets about writing that article, none whatsoever. You know, I did apologise if I'd offended anyone, because that was not my intention at all. That's not me. I'm not that kind of person. But no, I don't think I would have done things differently. I was given that opportunity. I was given that opportunity to speak out, and I took it. And I wish more people would. If they see things that are not going as they should, some things that are not right, don't walk away. Don't walk away.
Even if they didn't like the manner in which you delivered the message, it seems like a very punitive response to you, because clearly you had some useful insights that the service needed to take heed of.
Yeah.
So I'm sorry to hear, it sounds really brutal actually, the way you were treated. How have you restored your own well-being since then? Because you're still passionately involved in prison reform, so it hasn't turned you away from forensic work. So how have you restored your own well-being? What do you do to keep healthy?
Well, I live in a lovely area. I live in Suffolk, and it's about 15 minutes from the coastline. And I love looking out at the sea and just taking in the beauty, really. If I am stressed, if I just need some space, that's where I go. Most weekends, if I'm free, I'll go and have long walks. We've got Constable Country, 15 minutes from my house, John Constable. And I love art, absolutely love art. And I'd go to an art gallery. Just go out, get some fresh air. Music was very important to me when I was going through all the investigations and that, because I was rather sleep deprived at times, because I was so anxious, so worried. What were they going to do to me? What was going to happen? There was a lot of threatening words towards me. And, when people start saying, well, we're going to go to the Minister of Justice lawyers, I can't fight that. So there was a lovely piece of music that I used to play at night, just helped me calm down and just be able to sleep. And although that's past now, I'm not so anxious about things like that. Although I have had a lot of social abuse on social media. So it's like I need to every now and then go and find my ways of coping and dealing with it. But I love being outdoors. I just love it. I mean, I'm not a townie. I was brought up in the countryside. My granddad had a farm as a child, so I love being out there. And also, I like home cooking. I don't like processed food. I like good old fashioned. So I don't do fast food. I'm not really into all that kind of thing. So I try and keep myself going, and I have no real health issues. And I try and keep positive, and I try and be there for my family, and still am passionate about prison reform. And I will continue to be like that. And I'll continue to speak out. I won't be frightened to speak out. I mean, what more can they do to me? When you speak the truth, you're going to get you're going to get the backlash. But if you know in yourself that what you're doing is right, that motivates you, that keeps you going.
Thank you very much, Faith.
Faith, I think you mentioned that you had a blog.
Yeah.
Is that right? So what's the name of that?
It's the criminologistblog.com. I've been writing it since 2012, since just before I started with the IMB, and it covers all sorts of subjects. And I've also interviewed many people, that are involved in, like, as I call it, the justice arena. Some fascinating people, including journalists. And I try and keep up to date with what's going on. I've done a lot of work about IPPs. So there's quite a lot of blogs there, and I've done, I think, 133 blogs so far. And it's been read and shared in, the last time I counted, 106 countries. So someone's listening, someone's reading. But I like to do some research, and I like to, it's subjects that I'm passionate about. So it's some interesting reading, some interesting articles there.
So a real work of reference there online. So thanks very much indeed, Faith. Great to meet you.
Thank you very much.
Good to see you.
Thank you. Bye.